Hello, and welcome to El Ginebrino. I am your host, Bruno Ané, and today we dive into one of the most pressing challenges of our time, nuclear disarmament. When we think of the risks threatening our planet, there is no symbol more evocative than the Doomsday Clock. Conceived in 1947 by the Bulletin of the atomic scientist, experts who witnessed the devastating power of nuclear weapons, this clock is a metaphor, a reminder of the thin line between security and devastation. Its minute hand reflects how close we are to a global catastrophe, responding to changes in international tensions, nuclear threats, and challenges such as emerging technologies. With the end of the Cold War and the signing of the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty between the US and the Soviet Union, the Bulletin placed the clock hand at 17 minutes to midnight, or global catastrophe. As of today, we are only 89 seconds away from midnight. In this episode, we'll explore efforts to achieve a world without nuclear weapons. I am especially excited to have Florian Eblenkamp of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, ICAN. Florian, a friend and a remarkable professional, works with organizations across the world extending support for the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the TPNW. His experience and passion for peace have made him a trusted voice in the fight for a nuclear-free world. So sit back and join me as we move from the symbolic urgency of the Doomsday Clock to the complex efforts required to dismantle nuclear threats. Let's explore what it really takes to achieve nuclear disarmament. So, hello everyone. Today we are diving into the crucial topic of nuclear disarmament and the role of ICAN, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. To help us explore these issues, we have Florian Eblenkamp, a dedicated professional from ICAN and, more importantly, a friend and a former student mate from King's College London. Hello, Flo. Thank you very much for joining us today in this new season of El Ginebrino podcast. It's a pleasure to have you here. How are you?
Thanks, Bruno. Yeah, it's so cool to be on the podcast and to see you again. It's so nice that after.
I'm sure, Flo, that you will help us to disentangle such a complex topic as nuclear disarmament. What motivated you exactly to work in the field of nuclear disarmament?
So I was a student of international relations, and it was all right. But then often I had the feeling that specifically for like international multilateral processes, you need to have 35 years or 40 years of experience. You need to wear a gray suit, have a long red tie, and then people will take you serious. Otherwise, as a young person straight out of university, you have no credibility to talk about any of these issues. You just don't have the experience, kind of. In many fora, that's the case, right? These fora on nuclear disarmament were suddenly opened up to civil society. And people, ordinary people like me and you, can join these meetings at the UN and listen to governments talk about these things, and can also make a statement, and can get organized. And it's people from indigenous communities on which lands nuclear weapons were tested that can have a say now. And so I felt that's something I am really interested in, to get involved, and it was kind of possible then. So I reached out to a few organizations that work on this, got involved, and then it grew and grew and grew, and later it became a job, kind of. Very, very random, maybe.
What are we talking about when we talk about nuclear disarmament?
That's actually a good question, because for many decades, and speaking on behalf maybe of people in our generation especially, nuclear weapons were not on anyone's radar, right? Like, used to be a thing from the Cold War, something that is very abstract, that's also not really discussed in the media. So it's a fair question to ask what this is actually about. But essentially what nuclear disarmament tries to achieve is to get rid of nuclear weapons, or to reduce the number of nuclear weapons in the first place, maybe. And generally that's done through international treaties that countries sign up to, where they commit to a reduction of a certain kind of nuclear weapon, or the total elimination of nuclear weapon, or the gradual reduction of the arsenals and so on.
So it's both, maybe the reduction, but also the complete elimination. Like, and for those Flo who are not maybe aware of the role of ICAN, for those listeners that would like to get more and understand better, maybe what's the mission of ICAN and what are some of the core activities that maybe you focus on as well?
Yeah. So ICAN is the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. That's what the acronym stands for. And we are an international NGO, so we're not affiliated with the government or with the United Nations or any sort of, supranational organization. We're a small team here in Geneva and in a few other countries. And we are a civil society campaign that I'd like to say that we lobby governments to sign on to a treaty that prohibits all nuclear weapons related activities. And that has different forms, of course. In the early stages, we tried to get governments to negotiate a treaty that prohibits these activities. Then, of course, to bring it into force, to make countries sign it. And now it's about convincing more and more governments to sign it. And, of course, to work with those governments that have signed it to implement. Because as we might get into, there's currently an uprise in nuclear warheads numbers. So the trend is maybe going in the wrong direction at the moment. But even more so, it's, I guess, important that these discussions take place. And so, yeah, we're a small team of dedicated people who try to change the world.
This important role of ICAN involves at the same time building broader coalitions or stronger coalitions to advocate for this.
I mean, in one way, we work very closely with governments. And, I would say governments that usually don't have much in common. There's, democracies, there's autocratic states, there's, developing countries, there's very modern countries or very rich countries. There's countries with a very long history in nuclear disarmament. There's like geopolitical heavyweights. There's very small island states. There's, you name it, it's very diverse. An example could be, for example, Austria being a European country, very rich, very, integrated in the European Union, very conservative foreign politics in many ways, for example, regarding Israel. And on the other spectrum might be South Africa, that, these two countries don't share a lot in terms of foreign policy preferences, but on this topic, we brought them together and they actually work on this treaty. And the same also counts that we work with a very diverse group of civil society groups. So there has, I think now we have about 700 partner organizations in more than 100 countries, all across the world. And of course, some of them focus specifically on nuclear disarmament in a very similar way that we do, but others are environmental organizations, are organizations that advocate for gender equality, for all sorts of injustices. In a way also ICAN brings together a lot of diverse stakeholders into this debate.
And Flo, you mentioned the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, the TPNW, and ask you if you can provide us some insights on how this campaign was organized, but also what makes the TPNW so significant in the realm of international law and in the realm of nuclear disarmament.
The TPNW is a game changer in terms of international nuclear disarmament. It's the only treaty that prohibits nuclear weapons for all countries. So traditionally or historically, nuclear weapons are legal to possess for a certain number of countries, 5 countries, those that are in the United Nations Security Council, and illegal for everyone else. And of course, that creates some sort of like a 2-tier global system that gives a certain weapon to some countries, but not to others. Then, of course, over the time, you got to realize that actually other countries that shouldn't have them also have them, North Korea, for example, or Israel, or India and Pakistan, so-called non-official nuclear weapon states. And more, it became frustrating for the countries that don't have nuclear weapons, that they stick to their part of the deal, that they say, okay, we don't have them, we will not acquire them, we will not develop them. But the nuclear weapon states, on the other hand, never disarmed their arsenals, which was the agreement that they had. So they said, well, we will keep these weapons for now, you guys reject them, but we'll disarm. Now that hasn't happened. And then, of course, that got very frustrating. And that kind of brought about a movement to say, well, other weapons of mass destruction, like chemical weapons or biological weapons or landmines, good example. Eliminating those weapons only happened after they were universally illegal. So if all countries have the same legal standard, these weapons are unacceptable based on their humanitarian consequences, then we have a chance to actually shift the paradigm that nuclear weapons are unacceptable and therefore they can be disarmed. And there's a legal basis for something that's already, I think, a very broad moral understanding. So that's what this treaty does. In terms of ICAN, ICAN was founded in 2007 in Australia, just like people like us sitting at the kitchen table and thinking, this nuclear weapons topic is really something that our generation actually shouldn't have to deal with. It's an old technology, it's military kind of useless, despite almost all countries not wanting them. And eventually someone had the idea that why not should we all create a campaign together to advocate for a universal ban of these weapons, and so it grew. It's a very grassroots movement in its essence.
And Flo, when you mentioned that ICAN was born as a grassroots initiative, and then we have the work ICAN promoted towards the treaty. If you had to identify the main challenges towards that treaty from ICAN and maybe from other organizations that also work on the field.
But then, of course, the challenge is that you are up against the most powerful countries in the world, those that have nuclear weapons. They don't want to lose the narrative over these weapons, right? All of them have sort of this view that their own nuclear weapons are good and only for defensive purposes, and are only there to maintain peace. But the others' nuclear weapons, those are the rogue states. They should disarm. It's not fair that those have them. When the US speaks about Russia, that's a clear example. But you will very easily find that Russia uses the exact same language to justify their arsenal and so on. So being up against powerful countries is of course a huge challenge. And also more practically, if you don't have a government, a prominent rich country government in your back, it's very hard to fund a campaign with a few staff people with an unclear goal. There might be a treaty eventually, but is there really a majority at the UN for this? Who knows? And so it very quickly gets very existential for a campaign if you don't have government funding that's keeps you going for a few years.
Moving, Flo, to the current geopolitical context, witnessing resurgence in nuclear tensions globally, with several countries modernizing their nuclear arsenals. How does this increasing tension impact the global disarmament movement?
It makes it incredibly harder. Of course, there's tensions, for example, Russia threatening to use nuclear weapons, North Korea testing missiles, China building silos, Iran threatening to develop a nuclear weapon, Israel, of course, reckless rhetoric to use a nuclear weapon in Gaza. But also what we've seen is that the modernization of these arsenals has continued 10 years ago. Has started 10 years ago. So in that sense, it's not really a new trend, but it's something that's maybe stronger than before. And my observation is a bit that it polarizes a bit, right? So those who were against nuclear weapons now find many arguments to say, now we're even more against it. Look at what's happening. This is unbearable. Nuclear weapons clearly don't provide eternal peace and stability amongst great powers. But then there's the others who say, well, look at what Russia's doing. Now definitely we need nuclear weapons. So there's much less common ground between people who are pro-disarmament and for disarmament, which makes it so much harder to have genuine conversations about arguments, because you first of all need to even find a reason to talk to someone. And that's of course difficult.
And Flo, if you have to think about the role of the global South in leading at some point or supporting the disarmament efforts, what's your perspective on this?
I think this campaign is driven a lot by countries from the global South and campaigners from the global South. And campaigners includes for example, people who survived nuclear weapons testing in the Pacific Islands. So people who lived in French Polynesia, where France detonated nuclear weapons until 1996. And now their families have cancer. And so, our mission was a bit to bring these people into the United Nations and make their stories heard and make them the experts, who actually knows more about nuclear weapons than people who've experienced this. And of course, that includes also people actually from Hiroshima and Nagasaki who survived the bombings in 1945. And in terms of countries, it's very interesting that the TPNW also challenges this slightly, neo-colonial idea that only the global north can have nuclear weapons, or a few countries in the global north can have nuclear weapons, and all other countries are not worthy controlling the world, or some sort of this kind of arrogant attitude. And there's many countries in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia, in the Pacific Islands, that were key to this treaty, that based on their legacy with nuclear testing, or South Africa being an example of a country that used to have nuclear weapons, then dismantling nuclear weapons, and now being one of the strongest supporters of this treaty. So it's a very, I think a very interesting shift in power dynamics in the UN when we take this treaty into account.
If I'm not mistaken, Flo, in Latin America there is a Tlatelolco Treaty, right?
It's a treaty that prohibits nuclear weapons in Latin America. So it creates a nuclear weapon-free zone. That's the legalistic speak.
Yeah.
In all countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. It's widely supported, and of course, that experience and positioning of these countries helps a lot to bring in expertise to the TPNW, which is similar in the way that it prohibits nuclear weapons but allows for nuclear energy for civilian purposes, and gives these countries a global voice on this issue.
Let's take a moment to shift focus. As we move forward, we enter a rapidly evolving scenario where emerging technologies, particularly artificial intelligence, are reshaping the landscape of nuclear strategy. These innovations are not only enhancing our capabilities but also adding layers of complexity to the already challenging task of disarmament. Let's explore how AI and other cutting-edge technologies are complicating the narrative around nuclear weapons, potentially redefining the rules of engagement and security.
There's a huge amount of information concerning nuclear disarmament, but also new technologies applied to the military aspects of the defense budget of states across the world. And my question is, with the advancements in technology and the rise of cyber threats, how do these factors complicate or influence the global disarmament agenda?
It's a good point, and we see lots of talks about this, and I think also in wars that are taking place right now, we see the application of AI on drone strikes, on targeting and so on. And of course, in the case of nuclear weapons, it only makes disarmament more urgent. Imagine, AI in a nuclear weapons process could create so much additional uncertainty. There's this famous example from the 1980s where a Soviet officer saw on his radar that there's an American missile coming in, and the point was getting ever closer to Moscow, and it was like, according to the radar, it was sure the capital is going to be struck. This is the worst case they have trained for, and according to protocol, he would have had to alert his supervisors and facilitate the return strike. That was the military order he was supposed to follow. But he then decided, well, there's a missile coming in. If we shoot back, that's only going to kill more people in a large quantity. So he didn't report the incident. He didn't, kept quiet and saved the world, because it turned out that was a mistake, a simple technological mistake on his radar that showed something else, but not an incoming missile. And that was in the 80s. And now, if you talk about AI, sort of deep fake technology, and so on, you could only imagine that this can get so much worse. And with modern arsenals, it wouldn't take half a day for a missile to land in the other part of the world. It's within minutes, right?
Having in mind the new technologies, you mentioned the deepfake, cyber threats, which you described. And if we think about the future of nuclear disarmament, what do you believe is the most realistic path, or what do you foresee on the nuclear disarmament agenda?
I mean, there's this saying, it always gets worse before it gets better. And maybe that's also true for nuclear disarmament, right? Now we, of course, see slowing progress on disarmament, despite a lot of countries trying to really make a lot of effort. The window of opportunity for nuclear disarmament also will widen again. Mm-hmm. The question is, will it widen fast enough, or will it maybe be too late and countries only react after a nuclear weapon has been used again, with all the devastating consequences that would have? So there's no time to lose in that sense. It might have the benefit that ordinary people like us start talking about nuclear weapons more. So it's something that used to be in the back of people's minds, or not at all in their minds, but now it's really something that people read in the news, people hear about these threats.
It's in common people's agenda.
Exactly. Yeah. And so maybe that can help to draw a bit of political agenda towards, well, how can Europe be safe as long as Russia has nuclear weapons? And then you need to figure out something about it. I'm hoping that this is a bit of a wake-up call for the general public to join a movement. There's so many organizations in literally every country that keep working on this.
We have to keep pushing.
Exactly. Keep pushing is a very nice metaphor, because it always reminds me of one of my heroes, one of my inspirational role models, Setsuko Thurlow, a Japanese hibakusha, a person that survived the nuclear bombing in Hiroshima, 1945. She was 6 years old, and on the way to school when the bomb was dropped. Keep pushing is kind of our motto against all the resistance that the nuclear weapon states give us. Keep pushing towards the light is sort of the glimmer of hope that we have, and that she's inspired us to. Yeah.
Are there any upcoming activities or initiatives or campaigns that our listeners should be aware of? In
March, for those of you interested in the United Nations conference in New York, dealing specifically with the TPNW, the meeting of states parties. And then, of course, next year is the 80-year anniversary of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So we'll have a huge program in Japan for that, and try to make it a global movement. I often get asked how people can get involved, because they realize this is actually a problem, but then what do you do? Mm-hmm. Check out our website. There's so many partner organizations, and I'm sure you'll find one in your country as well, where you could get involved. That's also how I started, and eventually it became a job that I just thought I need to do something, and then I became a volunteer on a very small part-time basis, writing a few blog posts here and there.
As we always do, Flo, with our interviewees, I would like to ask you, as the last question, which book are you currently reading, or which one would you like to recommend to our audience? It would be anything about international politics, historic novel, nuclear disarmament, or whatever you're reading or you have read in the past that you would like to share with our audience.
Yeah, this is a bit cliche, but I'm actually reading a book called Nuclear War by the American journalist Annie Jacobsen.
Okay.
Right now, it's been on the New York Times bestsellers list for a few months now. It's very impressive, a bit scary, and even for someone like me who works on this, a lot of eye-opening stuff. Mm-hmm. Because she basically has done very impressive research on how nuclear war unfolds. That there's very short times for people to make decisions, there's very tight protocols that people have to obey, and once a certain trigger point is reached, there's very few checks and balances in that system that would actually verify threat level, the possible options, and so on. And it's a wake-up call for everyone who reads this book to get involved in nuclear disarmament and realize the insanity of this system that's supposedly there to keep us safe, which it fails to do. So yeah, that's a big recommendation to read.
But thank you so much, Flo, for being here with us in this new season of El Ginebrino podcast. So many thanks, Flo.
Thank you, Bruno. It's really cool to be a part of it.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to this episode of El Ginebrino podcast. We hope you enjoyed our discussion on nuclear disarmament and today's global security. If you liked it, please subscribe on your favorite podcast app and follow us on Instagram @El Ginebrino for updates, behind-the-scenes content, and more. Until next time, stay tuned, stay curious, and keep listening El Ginebrino podcast.
I know I should be strong, but my heart won't let you go.